Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, everyone. I'm Pete Crane, the Vice President of Education and Access here at the National WWII Museum. It's great to see everybody, and you know, a good number of you I've seen several times today, as we are marking the 80th anniversary of D-Day. So it's wonderful to have you here with us this evening. I'd like to start off with one of the highlights of all of our events here at the museum. Earlier we had the honor of having 10 veterans, a Holocaust survivor, and even a French resistance fighter here at the museum. And so it makes for a very long day for them, but I would like to take the opportunity to see if we have any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors with us tonight. If you are, please raise your hand or stand to be recognized. Yeah, I think we got them all earlier today, but I know we've got some watching online, so let's give them a round of applause anyway. Now, this one I know we've got because they're pretty easy to see. Do we have any other veterans, active duty military, or immediate family members of our military? If you have ever worn the uniform of this country, please either stand to be recognized or wave your hand. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for your service. I would also like to recognize our Patriot Circle and Charter members here tonight. If you would, wave your hands. Thank you. It's your support that allows us to bring top-notch public programming to the museum and to those watching at home. So thank you for your continued support. You know, absolutely. Let's. To cap off a wonderful day here at the museum, we're closing D-Day, the longest day, with the General Raymond Mason Jr. Distinguished Lecture on World War II. The Mason Lecture Series is devoted to the legacy of America's largest war. Past speakers have included writers, scholars, distinguished members of the armed forces, and journalists. The lecture series is open to the public through the generosity of the late Major General and Mrs. Raymond E. Mason, Jr. and the Raymond Mason Foundation. General Mason served in the European Theater of Operations during World War II in the 4th Armored Division in General Patton's 3rd Army. Prior to retiring from the Army in 1976, he held several high-ranking Pentagon positions, including Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, G3, and Special Assistant to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Logistics, G4. Tonight's Mason Lecture features best-selling and award-winning author Rick Atkinson. A moment ago, I said the series featured writers, journalists, and noted military members. Well, Rick checks off a lot of those boxes. You know, as a journalist, a writer, a historian, and while he didn't wear the uniform of the country, he did participate in the invasion of Iraq with the 101st Airborne Division. Before becoming a full-time author, Rick worked as a reporter, a foreign correspondent, and was senior editor at the Washington Post. Now, I don't mind admitting that I'm a huge fan of Rick and his writing. If he scribbled on a roll of paper towels, I would probably run down to the bookstore and get a copy. But don't just take my word for it. Audiences around the world are familiar with his Liberation Trilogy, a series focused on the United States and her allies' efforts to defeat Nazi Germany. In addition to the Liberation Trilogy, he's also the author of The Long Gray Line, In the Company of Soldiers, and Crusade. His current work, a trilogy on the American Revolution, saw its first volume released in 2019, entitled The British Are Coming, The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. He's a two-time recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for Journalism and History, recipient of the George Polk Award, and holds the 2012 Pritzker Military Museum and Library Literature Award for Lifetime Achievement in Military Writing. In 2022, he was awarded the American Spirit Award, the museum's highest honor given to individuals whose work reflects the values and spirit of those who served our country in World War II. In addition to his professional accolades, Rick has been a longtime friend and advisor to the museum, serving on our Presidential Counselors Advisory Group since its inception in 2006. He's been a frequent presenter at our International Conference on World War II, and 10 years ago today, he was on a boat in Normandy as one of our featured historians for the 70th anniversary of D-Day. So ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to welcome to the stage Rick Atkinson.
Well, thank you for that, Pete. Good evening. Thanks so very much for inviting me to be with you in this tabernacle of history and memory and honor tonight. I first visited the National D-Day Museum in this building in 2003 when I brought my daughter to New Orleans for the beginning of her freshman year at Tulane, and the subsequent transformation of that rather homely, single-building enterprise into this spectacular campus of pavilions has been simply breathtaking. This museum is the bricks and mortar. I'm going to put up a slide here if they'll help me. Well, maybe they won't. So this museum is the bricks and mortar embodiment of what the novelist John Updike meant when he called World War II the 20th century's central myth. He called it a vast imagining of a primal time when good and evil contended for the planet. A tale of Troy, whose angles are infinite and whose central figures never fail to amaze us with their size, their theatricality, their sweep. The war lasted 2,174 days, and by the end it had become the greatest catastrophe in human history, 60 million dead. That's 27,600 dead every day for 6 years, 1,150 dead an hour. If you were a German boy born between 1915 and 1924, the odds were that by 1945, the odds were 1 in 3 that you would be dead. 60 million dead in 6 years means a death every 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, snap. 1, 2, 3. That's World War II. George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, called it a great and terrible epoch. And new words would be required to describe it, words like genocide and superpower, which was a neologism coined in 1944. And old words assumed new usages, words like Holocaust. The war raged across 6 continents on those titanic 3-syllable battlefields that still serve as historical mileposts. Stalingrad, Tarawa, Anzio, Normandy, as well as in improbable settings rarely associated with the Second World War, places like the Aleutians, Madagascar, Syria, and Darwin, Australia. A great museum, like a great library, can be a time machine of sorts, allowing us to travel into the past in hopes of better understanding who we are and how we got here. W.G. Sebald was an elegant German writer born in Bavaria in 1944, and before his death in a car wreck in England in December 2003, he wrote, "We have appointments to keep in the past, in what has gone before and has, for the most part, been extinguished. And we must go there in search of places and people who have some connection with us from the far side of time. Well, toward that end, I'd like us now to keep an appointment in the past. 80 years ago, on the morning of May 15th, 1944, at St. Paul's School on Hammersmith Road in London, it's a Gothic building of red brick and terracotta, where Winston Churchill, George Patton, Omar Bradley, Bernard Montgomery, King George VI, and several dozen other American and British commanders gathered to review the final secret plan for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. They met in an auditorium known as the Model Room. They were sitting on 9 rows of hard wooden benches, normally used by schoolboys. The poet John Milton had been a student at St. Paul's, among other English luminaries. Even in mid-May, it was cold as a meat locker in the Model Room, and because German bombs had broken all 700 windows at St. Paul's, and many of the generals were bundled up in their overcoats. On the floor of the cockpit of the auditorium, there was an enormous plaster relief map of the Normandy coast where the River Seine spills into the Atlantic, at a scale of 6 inches to a mile. And as the plan was reviewed, a British brigadier wearing no-skid socks shuffled across the map with a pointer to indicate various locations on what in 3 weeks would be the most famous battlefield in the world. The beaches, for example, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. And towns like St. Lo, Cherbourg, Caen. The man running that conference is someone you know, Dwight David Eisenhower. The spring of 1944, he's 53 years old. He's smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day. And he's a 4-star general at the time of Normandy, but he's still in ascent, rocketing from lieutenant colonel to 5-star in 42 months. It's an average of 6 months between promotions. President Roosevelt has selected him as the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force because he is, as the president says, a natural leader with exceptional political instincts. He has a knack for getting along with the British, notwithstanding the Anglophobia that infests the senior American ranks. Unlike most of his U.S. Army peers, he likes the British. He's adopted words like petrol and tiffin. Drives Patton insane. He's also been chosen because he has exceptional organizational gifts. He describes himself as chairman of the board. That's the corporate metaphor he uses. Chairman of the largest martial enterprise in the Western world. The immediate task at hand is to catapult an army across that ugly piece of water called the English Channel, which is how the U.S. Army official history would describe it. That alone was among the most complex undertakings in the history of warfare. The channel is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest, but for nearly 1,000 years, armies invading across the channel, facing a hostile shore, had found more grief than glory. One British planner suggested that the only solution is to tow the beaches over already assaulted. The U.S. War Department had even pondered tunneling beneath the seabed. A detailed study deemed the project feasible, requiring 1 year and 15,000 miners to excavate 55,000 tons of spoil. Wiser heads question, quote, the strategic and functional complexities of that plan, such as the inconvenience of the entire German 7th Army waiting for the first miner's head to pop out of the tunnel. The study was shelved. Eisenhower and his comrades had so many worries in Operation Overlord that they had their own acronym, PINWE, Problems of the Invasion of Northwest Europe. For example, there was anxiety that German planes would drop rats infested with bubonic plague over London, and authorities in England offered bounties for rat carcasses to test for plague. There was anxiety that German aircraft would disperse what were called radioactive poisons over England, and Geiger counters were stockpiled to check for radioactivity. And of course, there was anxiety that Hitler would initiate chemical warfare, mustard gas, phosgene, and other toxins. The Allies stockpiled 160,000 tons of chemical munitions for retaliatory use in Europe and the Mediterranean. Planners had drafted, with Eisenhower's approval, 2 secret target lists for chemical warfare in Europe. One list tried to minimize French civilian casualties by hitting German troop concentrations, transportation targets, and bridges. The other list ignored potential French casualties and included dozens of communication centers in northwest France, including many, many post offices. French losses would have been even more enormous than they were from conventional bombs, artillery, and bullets. Similar combat efforts, of course, were also underway simultaneously in the Pacific. And even though this evening I'm focused mostly on the United States, let's acknowledge that when we talk about American dominance in the war, we ought not suggest that the United States was the preeminent killing power. Soviet forces killed roughly 9 times more German soldiers than British and US forces combined. The Red Army suffered more combat deaths at Stalingrad alone in late 1942 than the US armed forces sustained in the entire war. Of a Soviet population of 190 million, 14% perished. Of the American population of 130 million, about 1/3 of 1% perished. The United States had been among the last of the large powers to be drawn into this conflagration, but very quickly the war encumbered all of America. When the war began in earnest on September 1st, 1939, with the German invasion of Poland, the United States Army, still at peace, was a puny weakling. By one measure, it ranked 17th among armies of the world in size and combat power, right behind that perennial military powerhouse, Romania. The US Army in 1939 comprised 190,000 soldiers. It would grow to 8.3 million in 1945, a 44-fold increase. More than 16 million Americans served in uniform, again in a country of 130 million. Virtually every family had someone they loved in harm's way. Virtually every American had an emotional investment in our military. Virtually everyone had skin in the game. Fighting a world war required manpower, lots of manpower. By 1944, 11,000 young men were being drafted into the Army and Navy every day, a rate of 4 million a year. 1 in 3 GIs had only a grade school education. Slightly more than 1 in 10 had attended college for a semester or more. A private, by the way, earned $50 a month, although if he was awarded the Medal of Honor and survived the experience, he got an extra $2 in his paycheck. The typical soldier was 5 feet 8 inches tall. He weighed 144 pounds, but the Depression had been very hard on our nation's health. The desperate need for bodies in uniform, especially infantrymen, to go to places like Normandy, led to the drafting of what were known as physically imperfect men. I know that some women consider that phrase redundant. Standards had been lowered to accept defects that once would have kept many out of uniform earlier in the war. For example, draftees at one time had to have at least 12 of their natural 32 teeth. By 1944, how many teeth did you have to be drafted into the United States Army? 0. And that's because the Army and Navy drafted 1/3 of all civilian dentists in the US. Collectively, they extracted 1.5 million teeth. They filled 68 million more, and they made 2.5 million sets of dentures, all enabling each GI to be able to masticate the Army ration. I know that sounds like an obscene act, but that was the standard. By 1944, a man could be drafted with 2400 vision if it was correctable to 20/40 in one eye. The armed forces made 2.3 million pairs of eyeglasses during the war. The old joke had come true that the Army didn't examine eyes, it just counted them. In fact, you could be drafted with only one eye, or if you were completely deaf in one ear, or if you had lost both external ears, or if you were missing a thumb and 3 fingers on one hand, including your trigger finger. Venereal disease had kept many men out of uniform early in the war. That restriction also was lifted, and the Army soon was drafting 12,000 men a month with VD, most of them syphilitic. How could they do that? Penicillin. That extraordinary discovery by British scientists of the antibiotic agent in the 1920s was followed by a massive effort by the Americans and the British to take a substance that had been made by the gram and to make it by the kilogram and eventually by the ton. Mental and personality standards for service in the armed forces also had been loosened. In April 1944, the War Department decreed that draftees need have only, quote, a reasonable chance of adjusting to military life. Although psychiatric examiners at draft boards were advised to watch for 24 personality deviations, including silly laughter, sulkiness, resentfulness of discipline, and other traits that would seemingly disqualify every teenager in the United States. In addition, the Army also began drafting obsessive compulsives as well as stutterers. Why these extreme measures to fill the ranks? Because of the crying need for soldiers, especially infantrymen and especially riflemen. The war remained brutal and voracious to the very end. In April 1945, the last full month of the war in Europe, almost 11,000 American soldiers were killed in action in Germany, nearly as many as had been killed in June 1944, the month of invasion. It was awful to the last gunshot. The war cost U.S. taxpayers $296 billion. That's $4 trillion in today's currency. To help underwrite a military budget that increased 8,000%, President Roosevelt expanded the number of taxpayers in this country from 4 million to 42 million. Which takes us back to the late spring of 1944, 80 years ago. When that conference occurs at St. Paul's School on May 15th, American soldiers by the tens of thousands are pouring into Britain every week. Since January 1944, the number of GIs in Britain had doubled to 1.5 million. It's a country the size of Oregon. Of the U.S. Army's 89 divisions, 20 now could be found in the United Kingdom, with 37 more either en route or earmarked for the European theater. They came through Liverpool, through Swansea, Cardiff, Belfast, but most came into Glasgow and adjacent Greenock. More than 100,000 in April 1944 alone, 15,000 at a time arriving on each of the 2 queens, Elizabeth and Mary, ships that could haul an entire division apiece and outrun German U-boats to make the crossing from New York in 5 days. We can see them, can't we? Down the gangplanks they tromp, names checked from a clipboard, each soldier wearing his helmet, his field jacket, and a large celluloid button color-coded by the section of the ship to which he had been confined during the passage. Troops carry 4 blankets apiece to save cargo space. Deluded officers can be seen lugging folding chairs, pillowcases, and tennis rackets. A brass band and Highland pipers greet them on the dock. Scottish children raise their arms in a V for victory. Combat pilots who have fulfilled their mission quotas and are waiting to board ship for the return voyage to the U.S. bellow, "Go back before it's too late," Or, what's your wife's telephone number? Each arriving unit is listed in a master log called the Iron Book, and another manifest, the Forecast of Destination, shows where every company would bivouac momentarily in Britain. Then they fall in four abreast, into columns, and march from the dock to nearby troop trains to be hauled to 1,200 camps and 133 airfields across the British Isles. GIs called this new world Spam Land, but the prevailing odor came from burning feces in coal-fired incinerators operated by the U.S. Army School of Hygiene. Despite improving logistics, confusion and error abounded. The American juggernaut included millions of tons of materiel, most of it carried across the Atlantic in cargo ships that arrived days, if not months, after the troops on those fast queens. Truck drivers were separated from their trucks, drummers from their drums, chaplains from their chalices. Thousands of items arrived with indecipherable bills of lading or without shipping addresses other than glue, G-L-U-E, which was the code name for southern England, or bang, code for Northern Ireland, or ugly, code for unknown. The British Transport Ministry had allocated 120 berths for U.S. Army ships in May, but an extra 38 ships arrived. Almost half the cargo carried on those orphan vessels eventually was dumped outside various ports, including 5,000 tons of peanuts and 50,000 portable radios, all subsequently lost to exposure. GIs claimed that the Army was cutting red tape lengthwise. The landing of invasion vessels, the loading of invasion vessels in Britain bound for the far shore. That's what they called Normandy, since almost no one knew where they were actually going. That loading had begun on May 4th, 1944. It intensified as the month wore away. 7,000 kinds of combat necessities had to reach the Norman beaches in the first 4 hours, from surgical scissors to bazooka rockets, followed by tens of thousands of tons in the days following. Responsibility for embarkation fell to 3 military bureaucracies with acronyms evocative of the Marx Brothers: MOVCO, Turco, and Embarco. Merchant Marine captains sequestered in a London basement near Selfridge's department store prepared loading plans with the blueprints of deck and cargo spaces spread on huge tables. Wooden blocks scaled to every Jeep, howitzer, and shipping container were pushed around like chess pieces to ensure a fit. Soldiers in their camps laid out full-size deck replicas on the ground and practiced wheeling trucks and guns in and out. A great deal had been learned from earlier amphibious invasions in North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, the Pacific. A flotilla of amphibious vessels had been designed and built by the thousands in the previous 2 years. Higgins boats. And the LST, landing ship tank with clamshell doors and a bow ramp, each capable of carrying 20 Sherman tanks and putting them right on the beach. More than 1,000 LSTs were built during the war. In 22 British ports, stevedores slung pallets and cargo nets into holds and onto decks, loading radios from Pennsylvania, grease from Texas, rifles from Massachusetts. For Overlord, the U.S. Army had accumulated 301,000 vehicles, 1,800 train locomotives, 20,000 rail cars, 300,000 telephone poles, and 7 million tons of gasoline, oil, and lubricants. SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower's headquarters, had calculated daily combat consumption for each GI, from fuel to bullets to chewing gum, at 41.298 pounds per soldier every day. Again, we can see it, can't we? Day after day, war material cascading onto the wharves and quays, a catalog Homeric in magnitude and variety, radio crystals by the thousands, carrier pigeons by the hundreds, 100 silver stars and 300 Purple Hearts. Soldiers called the Purple Heart the German Marksmanship Medal. For every major general to award as warranted. Also, 600,000 doses of penicillin, 50 tons of sulfa, and 800,000 pints of plasma, meticulously segregated by black and white donors. A company contracted to deliver 10,000 Medal Crosses missed its deadline. Instead, Graves registration units would improvise with wooden markers. Cotton mattress covers used as shrouds for the dead had been purchased on the basis of one for every 375 man days in France. That formula proved far too optimistic. In July, with supplies of mattress covers dwindling, quartermasters would be forced to order another 50,000. This is war on the very largest scale, and it was only the beginning. In the European theater alone, the American prodigy of organization, that was Churchill's phrase, would ship 18 million tons of war stuff to Britain and the continent. That kit ranged from 800,000 military vehicles to footwear in sizes 2A to 22 EEE. By 1945, the United States had built 2/3 of all ships afloat worldwide and was making half of all manufactured goods worldwide. World war is a clash of systems. Which system can generate the combat power to prevail, whether it's in the form of the 12,000 Allied aircraft aloft on D-Day, the 10-to-1 advantage in artillery ammunition often enjoyed by the Allies, the mass production of penicillin and proximity fuses, the ability to design, build, deliver, and detonate an atomic bomb. Which system can produce and educate the men? And they were mostly men, which is why the war took so long. The men capable of organizing the shipping, the rail and truck transportation, the stupendous logistical demands of global war. It's often been said that in a fair fight, mano a mano, that when one American infantry battalion fought one German battalion, or a regiment fought a regiment, that the Germans were usually better. A fair fight? Who's looking for a fair fight? Germany, despite an undeniable genius for tactical and operational warfare, could not muster the wherewithal to cross the English Channel, 21 miles wide, to invade Britain. The U.S. projected power across the Pacific, the Atlantic, into the Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, the seven seas, the infinite skies. Adaptability, versatility, ingenuity, preponderance, raw power, those are the salient characteristics of the U.S. military in World War II. The enemy was crushed by logistical brilliance, firepower, mobility, mechanical aptitude, and an economic juggernaut that produced much, much more of nearly everything than Germany and the other Axis powers could make. Bombers, bombs, fighters, transport planes, mortars, machine guns, trucks. Yet the war absorbed barely 1/3 of the American gross domestic product. It's a smaller proportion than that of any major belligerent. A German prisoner complained, "Warfare like yours is easy." But of course, there was nothing easy about it. That grand final act of the European war began at Normandy, 80 years ago today. And how, almost 8 decades after the shooting stopped in World War II, do we assess the consequences? Well, the legacy of the war is as profound as the sacrifices that built that legacy. First, of course, Allied victory strangled the sinister ambitions of fascist regimes in Germany, Japan, and Italy. It also brought to an end the British and French empires. It politically fractured both a continent, Europe, and individual countries such as Korea, Vietnam, and Germany. It led to the creation of both the United Nations and NATO. And it yielded a bipolar world, part Soviet, part American, that persisted for half a century. A war that was fundamentally about liberty spawned independence movements and colonial wars that led to the creation of modern India, Pakistan, Ghana, Kenya, Israel, and other states in a fermentation that obviously continues to this day. We Americans emerged from World War II with extraordinary advantages that ensured prosperity for decades, an intact, thriving industrial base, a population relatively unscarred by war, cheap energy, 2/3 of the world's gold supply, great optimism. As the major power in Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific, possessing both atomic weapons and a navy and an air force of unequaled might, the United States was ready to exploit what the historian H.P. Wilmot described as the end of the period of European supremacy in the world that had existed for 4 centuries. The war dispelled American isolationism, and let's please not let it creep back. President Biden this morning in Normandy said that isolation was not the answer 80 years ago and is not the answer today. The war saw something worth applauding for. The war also encouraged American exceptionalism, as well as a penchant for military solutions and a self-regard that led some to label the post-war epic the American century. Remember what John Adams told us? Power always thinks it has a great soul. The war was a potent catalyst for social change across the Republic. New technologies, jets, computers, ballistic missiles, mass production of houses, soon spurred new industries, which in turn encouraged the migration of black workers from south to north and of all peoples to the emerging West. The GI Bill put millions of soldiers into college classrooms, my father among them, spurring unprecedented social mobility. World War II was perhaps the greatest agent of social change in this country during the 20th century. Our national evolution on core issues of racial and gender equality are very much shaped by the war. What did it cost besides $296 billion? Well, 13 U.S. divisions in Europe suffered at least 100% casualties. 5 more exceeded 200%. From all theaters, American service casualties in the war included 1,700 left blind, 11,000 with at least partial paralysis of one or more limbs, and 18,000 amputations. Aggregate numbers illuminate how unspeakably inhuman the war was. Teasing out those deaths one at a time affirms our humanity. As we consider these big arrows on the map, or the map that you should be looking at right now, and we contemplate the greatest self-inflicted catastrophe in human history, 60 million dead, it's proper to bear in mind the miraculous singularity of death. Each of those deaths was as unique as a fingerprint or a snowflake. Patricia O'Malley was a year old when her father, Major Richard James O'Malley, a battalion commander in the 12th Infantry, was killed by a sniper in Normandy. After seeing his headstone for the first time in the cemetery above Omaha Beach, she wrote, "I cried for the joy of being there, and the sadness of my father's death. I cried for all the times I needed a father and never had one. I cried for all the words I had wanted to say and wanted to hear but had not. I cried and cried. The Australian war correspondent Osmer White, who bore witness both in the Pacific and with Patton's Third Army in Europe, later wrote, "The living have the cause of the dead in trust. We the living, 337 million strong in America today, have the cause of the dead in trust." About 400,000 Americans died during the war, including 291,000 killed in action. After the war ended, there were 353 temporary American military cemeteries scattered around the globe. In 1947, the next of kin of all American troops who had been buried overseas, and that was nearly all who had died in Europe and the Pacific and whose bodies were recovered, those next of kin filled out Quartermaster Form 345. It was a one-time option offered by the US government whether to have their sons, and they were mostly sons, brought home for permanent reburial, or to have them interred in one of more than a dozen American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries overseas. They were being built to consolidate all those smaller cemeteries. Almost 40% chose to have their soldier left overseas. 60% asked to bring them home, at a cost of $564.50 for each disinterment, regardless of where they were ultimately permanently buried, something only a rich, victorious country could afford. Every grave was opened by hand, and the remains of every dead soldier dusted with an embalming compound of formaldehyde, aluminum chloride, wood powder, clay, and plaster of Paris. They were then placed in a metal casket with a satin pillow. Labor strikes in the United States caused a shortage of casket steel, and repatriation was further delayed by a dearth of licensed embalmers. In warehouses at Cherbourg, Cardiff, and elsewhere, the dead accumulated. Finally, the SS Joseph V. Connolly, the first of 21 ghost ships from Europe and the Pacific, sailed from Antwerp with more than 5,000 soldiers in her hold. On October 27, 1947, the Connolly berthed in New York. Stevedores winched the caskets from the ship, 2 at a time, in specially designed slings, and a great diaspora began as these dead and those that followed traveled, mostly by rail, across the Republic for burial in their hometowns or in national cemeteries. Among those waiting was Henry A. Wright, a widower who lived on a farm in southwestern Missouri, near Springfield. One by one, his dead sons arrived at the local train station. Sergeant Frank H. Wright, killed on Christmas Eve, 1944, in the Bulge. Then Private Harold B. Wright, who had died of his wounds in a German prison camp on February 3rd, 1945. And finally, Private Elton E. Wright, killed in Germany on April 25th, 2 weeks before the war there ended. Gray and stooped, the elder Wright watched as the caskets were carried into the rustic bedroom where each of those boys had been born. Neighbors kept vigil overnight, carpeting the floor with roses, and come morning they bore the brothers to Hilltop Cemetery for burial side by side by side. That's how the dead came home. But what of their belongings? What of the things they carried? Even before the dead came home, these things had been coming back. At a large warehouse on Hardesty Avenue in Kansas City, the U.S. Army Effects Bureau had begun as a modest quartermaster enterprise with a half-dozen employees in February 1942. That expanded to more than 1,000 workers, and by August 1945, they were handling 60,000 shipments a month. each laden with the effects of American dead from 6 continents. Hour after hour, day after day, shipping containers were unloaded from rail freight cars onto a receiving dock and then hoisted by elevator to the depot's 10th floor. And here the containers traveled by assembly line conveyor belt from station to station down to the 7th floor as inspectors pawed through the crates to extract pornography, ammunition, perhaps amorous letters from a girlfriend that would further grieve a grieving widow. Workers used grinding stones and dentist drills to remove corrosion and blood from helmets and web gear. Laundresses took pains to scrub bloodstains out of field jackets and uniform blouses. A detailed inventory was then pinned to each repack container before it was stacked in an enormous sequence of storage bins. And all the while, banks of typists in a huge adjacent room hammered out correspondence to the next of kin, up to 70,000 letters a month, the gist of which was this: Dear sir, dear madam, we have your dead son's stuff. Do you want it back? Where should we send it? Over the years, Effects Bureau inspectors found in these effects tapestries, enemy swords, a German machine gun, an Italian accordion, walrus tusks, a shrunken head, a tobacco sack full of diamonds. Among thousands of diaries collected in Kansas City was a small notebook that had belonged to Lieutenant Herschel G. Horton, 29 years old, of Aurora, Illinois, shot in the right leg and hip during a firefight with the Japanese in New Guinea. Horton had dragged himself into a grass shanty, and over the several days that it took for him to die, he had scribbled a final letter in the notebook. It began, "My dear, sweet father, mother, and sister, I lay here in this terrible place, wondering not why God has forsaken me, but why he is making me suffer. The first duty is to remember." Our recent poet laureate, Natasha Trethewey, ends her poem Pilgrimage, which is about a visit to the Civil War battlefield at Vicksburg, with these lines: "In my dream, the ghost of history lies down beside me, rolls over, pins me beneath a heavy arm." Let's not forget, 80 years later, to feel that heavy arm. Thank you again so much for asking me to be with you here in New Orleans. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, Pete, I think we have time for questions, right?
Yes, we will open up the floor for Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and either myself or Andrew will come hand the mic to you. Don't be shy. Oh, we have one in the back.
Hang on just a second,
One
sir,
second,
until she
sorry.
gets a microphone to you. So.
I'm right here, sir.
Hey, Captain Jim Simmons, why were you so surprised during the breakout of the 1,000-year-old hedgerows in Normandy and Brittany?
Yeah. Session 1 tomorrow morning. You'll hear about that because tomorrow morning people who are more expert on that than I am are going to talk about the push to Cherbourg right after. It's a really great question. It's a great question to which there are no really great answers. It was known by, among others, General Allenbrook, who had spent a fair amount of time in that part of France as a younger man. And he had recognized this odd topography, terrain that exists in Normandy, where Norman farmers over centuries had essentially cleared their fields, and they pushed the detritus in this clearing to the perimeter of the fields, which formed essentially barricades to anyone trying to move from one field to another. There were several million aerial photographs taken of Normandy before the invasion. They didn't show everything, but they showed a lot, and if you knew how to read them, you could see that there were these odd structures in Normandy. And there was other intelligence, too, from, among others, the French resistance, who sent some detailed reports that made their way to Eisenhower's headquarters. But when push came to shove and it came time during the breakout to work their way through this very rugged, difficult terrain, we were not ready. And improvisation was required. And some of you know that there were implements basically invented on the spot, where some extra scrap iron was welded on the front of tanks, and they were used almost like elephant tusks to bull through the hedgerows and to allow passage. It was an imperfect solution, but it was effective, finally. But the cost of not being prepared is always the same, and is paid in blood. And the casualties in Normandy, fighting in the hedgerows and elsewhere, were staggering. Thanks for the good question.
Is it, it's D plus, what was it?
D plus 1.
Say if you can elaborate on the D plus 1, specifically what happened immediately after.
Yeah, what happened immediately after? Well, they're on Omaha, Gold, Juno, and the rest, and they're a long way from Berlin. On D plus 1, we've had about 11,000 casualties on June 6, 80 years ago today. It's pretty staggering. The Germans have been fooled in the sense that they did not know where the invasion was going to come. There was a very elaborate deception scheme that some of you know about. The British, who have a genius for duplicity, had been mostly in charge of the deception scheme to make the Germans think that the invasion was going to come anywhere other than Normandy, particularly the Pas de Calais, which is the nearest part of the French coast to Britain. And this scheme, this sequence of deceptions, was quite effective in keeping the Germans at bay. They had many divisions to the north of Normandy. They had other divisions in Brittany, but they were not there to oppose the landings immediately. The Germans were confused by the landings. Rommel, who was the commander for all of the defenses along the Atlantic, was not in Normandy. He had driven home to Germany for his wife's birthday. He gave her a pair of shoes looted from Paris for her birthday. And he gets the word that, oh my God, they're here. So they're here, but they're on a very narrow strip. Now, the Canadians have advanced farther than anyone else, but farther is not very far. The Americans are no longer pinned down on Omaha Beach, but they're basically on the bluffs and not much farther. Utah Beach, as some of you well know, the American landings there had gone awry for various reasons. They landed hundreds of yards away from where they had intended to land. That proved to be a godsend because the defenses in that sector where they actually landed were less robust than they were on the original landing site. The two American airborne divisions that had jumped into the Cotentin Peninsula, the 101st Airborne, we got a couple officers here today from the 101st, they were badly, badly deranged. The drops had gone awry. Many paratroopers had been dumped into the Atlantic or dumped someplace other than where they were supposed to be dumped. Great confusion all around, including, it has to be said, among the Germans who were confused by, we've got reports from all over the place of paratroopers. And the same was true for the British airborne invasion on the other end of the beachhead. Again, some success, a lot of confusion, a lot of casualties. So on D+1, the ambition is to push inland, to get the landing forces away out of artillery range, meaning you've got to get, at least 6 miles inland so that German artillery can't range the beaches, to bring more soldiers in, to bring more stuff in. I talked about the 7,000 combat necessities that were needed in the first 4 hours, and more of everything was needed. So the ambition is to push in as far as you can. The Americans are going to swing to the right, if you're looking at the beaches. The British are trying to, this is under General Montgomery, who's the overall commander of the invasion, under Eisenhower. Montgomery's intent was to fix the German defenders, to hold them in place, allowing the Americans to break loose around the right and capture Cherbourg. We're going to talk about this tomorrow morning also. Why are we in Normandy? Well, the ambition is first and foremost to capture a port, because for waging this industrial strength war, you got to have a port. And the port they had their eye on was Cherbourg. Not a huge port, but it would have served nicely. As you'll hear tomorrow, if you come to the first session in the morning, getting to Cherbourg, the intent was to be there in a week. They were not there in a week. The intent was to open it up at D+10, 3 days after capturing Cherbourg. The first large vessels came into Cherbourg in August, partly because the Germans, if the British have a genius for duplicity, the Germans have a genius for destruction. And they blew that port all to hell. It was described by Eisenhower's headquarters as the most important port in the world, and it was subsequently described by an engineer as the most thoroughly destroyed port ever seen. So that's where they're going on D+1 in the days that follow. And it's going to be long and painful, in part because of the hedgerows that we talked about a minute ago.
The next question will be in the back to your right with Andrew.
Hi.
Yes. Do we know if there was anybody high up in Quartermaster Corps or Materials Office who, when they first saw the logistical expectations coming down the pipeline, said, "You have got to be kidding me"?
Oh, well, Pete? Pete and I were just talking a few minutes before I came up here to the stage about him pushing fuel forward in Iraq because you don't go anywhere if you don't have fuel. This is the invasion of 2003. And any logistician looking at the challenges ahead would have at least been thinking, you've got to be kidding me, because this is really hard stuff. Among other things, they decided they were going to build 2 artificial piers. They were called mulberries. And it was a staggering project that had been underway secretly in England, using every welder in Britain to put together the pieces that were going to be then assembled. Mulberry A was American, Mulberry B was British, and this is how they were going to bring stuff ashore until Cherbourg was captured. And when Cherbourg was not captured on D+7, those mulberries became all the more important. Unfortunately, the weather, which had not cooperated before D-Day, because as many of you know, the invasion was supposed to occur on June 5th, not 6th, but a bad storm. And then there's another storm comes along, completely destroyed Mulberry A, and pretty well wrecked Mulberry B. Now, when we look at the American engineers, military engineers, trying to build that pier in Gaza to take humanitarian assistance ashore, we can be sympathetic to the difficulty of doing this, and they've had problems there. It's not just going in and laying down some flotation devices and driving trucks across them. It's not that easy. So, part of the answer to "you got to be kidding" is, okay, well, we'll build these structures. Well, that didn't work out as planned either. So, the long and the short of it is that the logisticians in general, British, American, Canadian, and other nationalities, were spectacular in the long run. Really spectacular. Anybody who studies the campaign in Europe just has to be stunned by the overall effectiveness of the logistical effort, even though there were many bumps along the road. When they didn't capture Cherbourg right away, that made them be looking for other ports. Well, Antwerp was the obvious answer to all of the problems. And I won't go into it here, but first of all, they had to get to Antwerp. And they got there once the breakout from Normandy occurred. They got to, the invasion forces raced across France. They captured the port of Antwerp intact. Germans didn't have time to do their destruction thing. But, again, this goes back to the question of why didn't they know? Why didn't they know that Antwerp is inland? It's 50 miles up the River Scheldt. And if you don't control the banks of the River Scheldt, Antwerp is worthless. And so what we're going to see is intense, brutal, bloody fighting to clear the Scheldt so that Antwerp ultimately can be the port of every quartermaster's dream, which it will become, but it's not when it should have been. Thanks for the question.
We'll have one final quick question here in the back.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Atkinson. In planning the invasion, did the Army seek out or accept any input from the Marines' experience in the Pacific up to that point?
Yes. There were lessons learned. There were some American officers in Normandy who had experience in the South Pacific. Joe Collins, for example, a Corps commander who's in charge of the effort to capture Cherbourg, had been at Guadalcanal. He said that the bocage, the hedgerows in Normandy, reminded him of South Pacific jungle. There were studies done of the landings that had been made up to that point, and the Navy and the Marines had a fair amount of experience. The Army did too, in North Africa, as I mentioned, and in Italy, at Anzio. There was also going to be another landing in southern France. Originally, it was supposed to be timed simultaneous with the Normandy landing. This is a force coming basically out of southern Italy, landing in the south, and driving north to make Europe instantly a two-front war. Well, the shipping is always the narrow bottleneck through which every strategic decision in warfare must be made. And there was not enough shipping to have that southern France landing occur concomitantly with the Normandy landing, and that landing won't happen until mid-August. So all of these experiences that have happened previously and the planning that's going on try to gin in some of the lessons learned. I think, with some efficiency. Normandy had its own unique characteristics. The tides are enormous. If any of you have been to Normandy, it's a 20-plus foot tidal swing. In other words, if you're standing at the water's edge at low tide, at high tide, 6 hours later, it's 20 feet over your head. So that causes a lot of difficulties for planners. So, the answer is yes. The planners were not stupid, and they tried to profit from mistakes and successes that had happened before. But Normandy is Normandy. Thank you again so much for having me here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rick, for a wonderful talk tonight. I can't think of a better way to mark a milestone anniversary in this place, this building that opened 24 years ago as the D-Day Museum. So as we close today's 80th anniversary of D-Day commemorative events, tonight's lecture is also the kickoff to the Jenny Craig Institute's anniversary symposium, Beyond the Beaches, D+1 in the Battle for Normandy. It'll be taking place tomorrow in the U.S. Freedom Pavilion, the Boeing Center, starting at 8:30. Tomorrow's program sessions will focus on the actions that took place after Normandy landings on June 6th. Historians will present and discuss topics such as the fighting on the Cotentin Peninsula, actions of the British, Canadians, and Polish soldiers, the collapse of Germany, and more. A full rundown can be found in the programs, just like this one, that you'll find on the tables on your way out. And I hope to see you tomorrow, bright and early at 8:30 a.m. for a full day of engaging and exciting discussions on the fight to liberate Normandy. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that right over there, Rick will be signing books tonight at the table near the landing craft. And although he's going to join us tomorrow to chair our first session, and so you will be seeing him again, let's give Rick another round of applause for this evening. Thank you, sir, and thanks to all of you for joining us here tonight. We'll see you tomorrow.